Hello and welcome to the Haaretz Podcast. I'm Alison Kaplan-Summer in Tel Aviv. Over the weekend, just as Israel hit the depressing milestone of 700 days of war in Gaza, Defense Minister Israel Katz posted a photo of a bombed high-rise building in Gaza City, announcing, quote, "We have begun." And indeed, the large-scale invasion of Gaza City has begun, with the bombing not only of that one high-rise, but several others, likely with many to come. All is not going smoothly in Gaza City. Only a fraction of residents have left their homes and the city. The more people that remain, the higher the civilian casualty count will be as the attack intensifies. News of the imminent invasion of Gaza City has struck fear in the hearts of all who care about the remaining Israeli hostages in Gaza, as rumors and reports fly that Hamas may be moving them into the city as human shields. The streets of Jerusalem over the weekend were crowded with tens of thousands of protesters crying out against the proposition by the Netanyahu government that reoccupying and invading Gaza City will somehow lead to the elusive, quote, total victory, the capitulation of Hamas, and release of the hostages. And yet, that offensive moves on continuously, seemingly unstoppable. The only man who has the power to stop or slow it is likely President Donald Trump. So we'll be checking in with Haaretz Washington correspondent Ben Samuels for an update on Trump's decidedly mixed messages and whether any hope remains that the U.S. president could or wants to put the brakes on the new offensive in Gaza City with any kind of a ceasefire hostage deal, or if it is indeed full steam ahead. My conversation with Ben Samuels coming up.
I'm Esther Solomon, Editor-in-Chief of Haaretz English. Around the world, the fight is on to preserve critical and independent media. Haaretz, Israel's oldest newspaper, upholds its long tradition of accurate, committed, and incisive journalism, refusing to bend its reporting to pressure from any government or leader. A digital subscription to Haaretz gives you up-to-the-minute news and analysis in English from journalists who live Israel's reality and are committed to covering the Middle East and its global repercussions. At the same time, your subscription supports the cause of a free press that holds the powerful to account in Israel and around the world. I invite you to become a subscriber to Haaretz now. Just go to Haaretz.com and use the code Haaretz10, that's Haaretz with the number 10, for 10% off an annual subscription.
Ben Samuels, Haaretz Washington, D.C. correspondent. Welcome back to the podcast.
Great to be with you.
Ben, let's start with the messages that President Donald Trump has been sending us, decidedly mixed ones. Over the weekend, he said that the U.S. was in, quote, very deep negotiations with Hamas. What exactly did he say is happening?
You know, it's really unclear what he was saying, because when he gets asked these questions at these open press engagements, he goes on these sort of long-winded 3-minute answers where he hits on most of his administration's talking points. He also speaks very kind of word of mouth about like what he is thinking. It's 95% grounded in fact about what's happening, but it also has his own very Trumpian spin on things. So there's no sign that he's undergoing direct negotiations with Hamas. In fact, the one back channel that they had with Bashar Baba left the negotiations over the summer because of the lack of movement in the negotiations, and Hamas denied it. So it's very unclear, and it's probably not factually correct. The U.S. is deep in negotiations with Hamas, but they're probably still ongoing with negotiations with mediators like Qatar and Egypt. At the same time, what has been very clear from the Trump administration is that they are outsourcing all policy on Gaza to Israel. And they're effectively giving Netanyahu a blank check and saying, you do what you need to do, just get it over with fast so we can start moving on to the day after. Not only that, but they've also shifted their approach, or rather than looking at these sort of phased tiered deals for ceasefires and hostage releases, Trump is demanding that all hostages be released for any ceasefire to take hold.
So it seems like Netanyahu and Trump are aligned in their position. No more talk of small deals, partial deals. It's all or nothing.
Effectively, yeah. I mean, it's hard to say aligned because it doesn't really seem like there is like a fully articulated policy coming from America. They are just effectively telling Israel to do what they need to do. And Netanyahu, we should remind our listeners, had been pushing for a tiered deal over an entire deal for basically the duration of the war. It only changed recently once Trump made his demands and once it became clear that Hamas was willing to accept a phased deal. So, they're technically on the same page, but it also really kind of begs the question, what does Trump actually want here and what is he willing to do to get it done?
Or if they've already basically made the decision that they're going to press ahead full steam on the Gaza City offensive and therefore are not presenting a deal that could effectively happen because, the wheels are already in motion with the attack.
Right. But at the same time, this is one of those things that only U.S. pressure can prevent this from occurring. So unless they really deeply believe that either the U.S. has already given full approval or that the U.S. just would withhold any objections that they have, then they do have effectively a green light. What exactly does a green light look like to Israel? In their mind, it means that Trump is not giving a red light. That is what a green light is.
So these reports in the Israeli press that Steve Witkoff, Trump's envoy, is conveying these messages to Hamas through Israeli peace activist Gershon Baskin, that the messages include terms for a comprehensive deal. And, in response, we've got senior Hamas officials saying that no such communication is happening. The U.S. administration has not presented any new plan that could serve as a basis for ending the war in Gaza. Who do we believe, Trump or Hamas?
What a good option. The thing with Gershon Baskin is that he has had a back channel with Hamas for decades. He played an essential role in the Gilad Shalit deal of several decades ago. And, it's not necessarily an either or situation that there has probably been some communication there between him and Hamas. Witkoff has so much on his plate. Not only is he dealing with Ukraine, but he's also reportedly trying to help figure out a situation to clear the path for New York City Mayor Eric Adams to become ambassador to Saudi Arabia to consolidate the opposition against Zoran Mamdani. You're really seeing this guy who's technically responsible for one issue being responsible for some of the world's biggest issues. And while, the United States technically has a Secretary of State, there are a lot of cooks in the kitchen with even more things to worry about. And it's really unclear who's steering the ship here.
So these very sad and desperate hostage families, the protesters keep going to the U.S. embassy, or usually the U.S. branch office in Tel Aviv, and addressing their pleas to the Trump administration. They even lay a red carpet and held up a fake Nobel Peace Prize in their desperation to convince Trump that there will be glory for him if he ends the war. But that's not how Trump is talking. So it would be hard to believe that Israel would be conducting such a major operation without, as you said, if not a green light, a lack of a red light on Trump's part. I'm wondering, Ben, is this part of the wider conversation in America as to whether Trump sees himself as a tough war maker or a Nobel Peace Prize prospective winning peacemaker?
Everything that Trump does with foreign policy has to be framed with the perspective of Trump asking, what does this do for me? Back a few months ago when there were still living American hostages, that's when Trump said, do whatever you need to do to get it done. That's when he empowered his special hostage envoy, Adam Mueller, to undertake direct negotiations with Hamas to secure the release of Idan Alexander, completely circumventing Israel. Then, you hear him say stuff about peace through strength. You hear him talk about how he wants the Nobel Prize, but he'll never get it because of the international community's vendetta against him. But at the end of the day, everything that Trump does is done through filter of transactionalism, and it is him asking himself, what does this do for me? The hostage families, while, wishing them the best on their mission, he's not really going to be moved by that. What he's going to be moved by is seeing that the hostage families are affecting his bottom line of popularity in America. They're affecting his bottom line of being able to achieve the kind of foreign policy that he wants to achieve. So until that message is made clear to him in a way that he will understand, every sort of opposition to whether it is demanding that he do more to release the hostages or demanding that he do more to surge humanitarian aid to Gaza, whatever it may be, until he understands that it is in his personal best interest to push these policies, there's just not much that's going to happen.
Ben, Trump said in these latest remarks that some of the 20 hostages who are presumed to be alive in Gaza may have, quote, recently died. It's not the first time he's done something like this. It sends every time the hostage families, the whole country, into a tailspin. Do you know why he's doing this? Do you know if this is really based on information? As you said, you think it's 90% based on information. Why constantly the reference to, well, it's not really 20 of them, some of them may be dead?
He probably gets read out on the latest intel from Witkoff, and Witkoff has access to unparalleled information. The U.S. intelligence apparatus is the most powerful intelligence agency that's ever existed. So, it is unfortunate to say the least, and to put it in the most basic of terms, that these families are finding out this information from Trump throwing it kind of as like an offhand aside at a press gaggle. This should be information that is communicated very expeditiously by the Israeli government. For starters, that should be the least that they're entitled to. But, again, it just harkens back to the fact that Trump is just talking about this like it is like one of many issues that are on his plate as president. And it's like, oh yeah, this is the latest I heard about it. Here is what I think is the latest based off my access to information, being the most powerful person in the world and being committed to press transparency unlike any other president before. And that is his logic in, holding these regular gaggles. But there is, other than the footage that's been released by Hamas with the family's permission to air it publicly, there is just very little public information available on the state of the hostages, other than the fact that every second counts and that they are all in extremely dire circumstances as we approach the 2-year anniversary of October 7th.
Ben, do you see anything on the political landscape in the U.S. that could make Trump change his mind and put the brakes on this offensive? Any kind of echoes of feedback that could affect Trump, or he seems, locked into his position for now?
We are about a year out from the midterm elections. We're even closer to the Republican and Democratic primaries. And covering a few of these elections, I understand that people very often say that this is going to be the one where Israel becomes a top tier front of mind issue that could really divide voters and could really sway races one way or another. I think this is really the year where that could hold true, both in the Republican and the Democratic Party. You're already seeing it in the Democratic Party primarily, which has kind of been 2 steps ahead of the Republicans in terms of the center not really being able to hold when it comes to the status quo of U.S.-Israeli policy. Just the images that have been emerging from Gaza and the lack of holding Israel accountable have really forced sort of centrist Democrats to really sort of get off the edge and to really take a position one way or another. With the Republicans, it's a really similar dynamic where, there's diehard conservative supporters of Israel in the GOP that are really facing on these foreign policy isolationists. So it's not only foreign policy isolationists that are kind of at odds with the mainstream, conservative Republican Party, but it's a growing number of mainstream Republicans as well that are just in the image of Trump America Firstism, that are saying, why are our dollars going to funding a foreign war rather than making the lives better for Americans at home? So it's going to be really interesting to see how candidates really toe this line in the coming months.
So interestingly, let's talk about the Republicans for a minute, and then we'll switch back to the Democrats. But it's the Trump forces, it's the MAGA forces that are questioning this support of Israel. And like you said, the more traditional Republicans who tend to be more at odds with Trump, who are more on board with his policy, right?
Yeah. And I mean, it's interesting because before, like if you say a year ago or 2 years ago, it was only Thomas Massie sitting on the sidelines being the sole no vote for, sending foreign aid to Israel or to recognize the U.S.-Israel relationship through symbolic resolutions. But what you're seeing now is you're really seeing thought leaders in the party really start to make an effort to really holistically question the state of the U.S.-Israel relationship. And it's not necessarily coming from like a Christian theological place, but it's coming from, is this in America's best interest that we are using Americans' taxpayer money to send bombs and to prevent the surging of humanitarian aid when there are people starving in America and our money is instead going to kill civilians in Gaza? Is that in the Republican Party's interest? And a growing number of Republican lawmakers and Republican thought leaders are saying no.
Who are the leading voices in that? You talked about Republican Party. I was thinking more of, media voices like Tucker Carlson's and Steve Bannon's, but who's leading the charge on this?
Well, Marjorie Taylor Greene is definitely the most prominent lawmaker. And, to be clear, there aren't a lot of Republican lawmakers that have taken this lead. It's pretty similar to what the Democratic Party was looking like in 2022 or 2021, where there were these, the so-called squad, and there were a growing number of progressives, and their voice was bigger than their numbers. And, you would say the Democratic Party's in divide, and then you would look at the actual vote totals, and it would be 6 or 7 Democrats that would be voting against the status quo. The Republican Party's in kind of a similar position right now where, Marjorie Taylor Greene is really leading the charge, but it is definitely a harbinger for things to come. And if anyone thinks that it is just like kooky far-right GOP, like ideologues that are pushing this and they're completely out of sync with the rest of the party, they're just wrong.
It's interesting, right? Because Marjorie Taylor Greene is presumably part of the evangelical wing, wanting more of a Christian nation. And the evangelicals have tended to be more knee-jerk pro-Israel. But you're talking about decoupling of that ideology.
Yeah, and it's not necessarily that they're mutually exclusive with her, but this isn't just one small fringe of the party that's saying this. This is like a growingly significant part of Donald Trump's base that is openly questioning the wisdom of backing Israel to do whatever it wants. And that fringe is probably going to grow in the coming months and years.
Moving back to the Democrats, is there any kind of united Democratic voice on what's happening in Israel, or are the internal divisions really, really sharp? Zohran Mamdani's candidacy in the New York mayoral elections, how is that having national reverberations? There are some top Democrats who haven't endorsed his candidacy, right, even though he's officially the Democratic candidate.
Right, and you're seeing the leadership that has been very reluctant to endorse him. They're really becoming on the outside of the center of the party. And the center is taking a decided shift left, even if it is just temporary. But, you're seeing the plurality of the Democratic Party calling for an immediate ceasefire. You're seeing a growing number of Democrats, a significant number of Democrats. In fact, the majority of Senate Democrats for the first time are now supporting suspending offensive arms sales to Israel. You're seeing Biden's former national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, saying that would be a good idea after spending a year and a half lobbying Democratic lawmakers to not support this. So you're really seeing a shift. A lot of it is sparked by Trump, to be fair, but a lot of it is also just sparked by sort of outrage and just sort of fatigue with what has become just blank check U.S. support for Israel. And with Mamdani, it's interesting because a lot of his circumstances are unique to New York. I don't think would be fair to necessarily draw a direct correlation between what's happening in his race with what's happening in the country. But at the same time, you are seeing a growing number of progressive lawmakers in his ilk that are running for national office, that are either running for Senate in Maine or Michigan or wherever it may be, or like back house races. And they're saying that, very similar to what a lot of these Republicans are saying, that U.S. taxpayer money should be going toward funding construction of schools and hospitals and improving roads and not sending bombs to Israel to use in Gaza. So, the conversation, which has been moving in a pretty intense way over the past few years, it really hit a watershed over the summer. And what you're seeing now is that Democrats are really intensely moving on this issue, and it doesn't show that it's going to stop anytime soon.
The watershed was the humanitarian crisis and the starving Palestinian children all over the television screens. Is that it?
Yeah, that's it. I mean, I don't think you can overstate how much the emerging famine that, really hit a threshold over July really impacted the way that politicians are viewing this issue and the way that their constituents are viewing this issue and communicating it accordingly to politicians.
You reported that 3 prominent Democratic senators have called on the Trump administration to pull their $30 million in funding for the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which presumably is going towards feeding those starving children, right?
Yeah, but, again, a lot of these Democratic lawmakers have increased fluency in what exactly the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation is, and they understand that this is effectively a vehicle of both the Trump administration and the Israeli government, rather than allowing for very previously established humanitarian organizations to be the ones in charge of aid. So why only 3 Democratic lawmakers signed on to this letter, I don't necessarily know, because, it is something that many, many Democratic lawmakers do have an understanding of. To Gaza Humanitarian Foundation's point, that could show that what they actually are doing is above board, and that they are, doing everything they can to feed civilians in Gaza and to circumvent, whatever hold on aid that Hamas had before. But you really are seeing Democrats understand that they are just not going to take what Israel is saying at face value anymore.
Ben, so it seems that Secretary of State Marco Rubio does have a few things he's allowed to do. He has denied and revoked visas from members of the Palestinian Liberation Organization and the Palestinian Authority, including Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas. That's connected to this large-scale suspension of approvals of visitor visas for Palestinian passport holders. Not alone, there are other nations and people being denied entry to the United States. But the UN General Assembly is coming up in a couple of weeks. So as it looks now, is it going to be a Palestinian leaderless General Assembly?
Most likely, there are probably going to be maybe a few exceptions for permanent Palestinian members to the UN. But, again, this is part and parcel toward what the Trump administration has been doing, the very little active decisions they have been making on this, which has been primarily targeting Palestinians through diplomatic means, whether it is the sanctions taken on Palestinian civil society organizations or leading ICC experts, based on Trump's executive order targeting the International Criminal Court, or Trump, giving into pressure from, or I should say Rubio, giving into pressure from prominent far-right activist Laura Loomer to suspend tourist visas for Palestinian passport holders that are seeking emergency medical care in America. And that's expanded to basically every Palestinian passport holder. And then that has since expanded to basically every Palestinian trying to seek a diplomatic visa to attend the UN General Assembly. And what you're seeing now, the next step in this, is that the US is really starting to take on its key allies across the world who have decided to recognize Palestinian statehood and independence unilaterally, and saying that this is their fault. And not only is this their fault, but any potential Israeli steps toward annexation of the West Bank is also their fault. So you're seeing the Trump administration, led by Marco Rubio in this case, really take on the issue of Palestinian national aspirations as their sort of key cause of the moment. And not only that, but using it as a wedge between them and their key European allies that they obviously need support from for a variety of reasons outside the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that we care about.
Ben, is Trump's relocate the Palestinians and build a Gaza Riviera tourism paradise plan still alive in any way, shape, or form? Is there any conversation around the Trump White House or in Washington about a day after plan for Gaza?
So there is a conversation ongoing about the day after plan, but with the absence of anyone that is actually saying this is a bad idea, what you're seeing is the two camps are really being boiled down to, okay, this is the sort of quote unquote evangelical camp, and it's, the people that are extremely pro-Israel, motivated by their own Christian theology. And on the other camp, it's people that are sort of motivated by a financial bottom line that places economic prosperity over everything else. So what you're seeing in the one camp with, Mike Huckabee and his staff is that they're really trying to avoid giving a red light, which in effect would be considered a green light. On the other hand, you have outside experts that have been advising Woodcock over the past several months, like Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who is the architect of the Abraham Accords in the first term, which very famously used a bypass around the Palestinians to pursue Israel's own economic integrity in the Middle East. And also former British Prime Minister Tony Blair, who in his decades working on this, especially over the past summer when his NGO was, consulting with the Boston Consulting Group, really kind of clearing the path for the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. What you're really seeing is, a camp of people that are really prioritizing, okay, what can we pursue economically that will really allow Gaza to not necessarily be an issue for us, but to be some sort of pathway toward an economic boon.
Ben, to put it mildly, things aren't looking good for the upcoming few weeks. Presuming that this Gaza City offensive is irreversible, it's pressing on. There's no reason to think it won't. There are going to be high civilian tolls, high humanitarian crises. We're going to probably see some bad news regarding the hostages. There's all kinds of reports here that they're being moved into Gaza City as some form of human shields. We've got the Jewish New Year coming up, Rosh Hashanah. Where is all of this going to hit the minds and psyches of American Jews? How do you see American Jewish organizations reacting to what's going on right now?
Listen, I think American Jewish organizations have been already navigating a tightrope that has been pulled to its most taut of tensions in terms of maintaining support for the state of Israel while offering some sort of very subtle, to put it generously, subtle criticism of the Israeli government. And this has been a tension that has been growing throughout the Jewish community outside of the Jewish establishment. The Jewish establishment is always sort of the last one that seems to get on board with saying, okay, actually, this may be a bridge too far. But with the high holidays coming up and the 2-year anniversary of October 7th coming up right after that, I think everyone is acutely aware of the moment in time that we find ourselves and the inflection point that American Jewry finds itself, both in terms of how it relates to the state of Israel, how it carries that burden domestically with growing anti-Semitism and with, the tendency to blame American Jews for what's happening in Israel. And, I think we are going to look at this as a foundational shift in how this generation and the next generation views the U.S.-Israel relationship and views the relationship of American Jews to Israel. And that will be among Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's legacy, among many other points of fact that have emerged over the past 2 years.
Well, Ben, we'll leave it on that note and wish us all good luck in the coming weeks and months, and hope that it's a better scenario than it appears to be shaping up to be. Thanks so much for your reporting, and thanks again for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
And that's it for this episode of the Haaretz Podcast. Thanks to my guest, Ben Samuels, and to producer and editor Nara Malkin. If you'd like to continue to listen to our podcast, make sure you never miss an episode. Please subscribe to us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you are inclined, please leave us a 5-star rating, and that way more people can find us. And to keep up with all the latest news on Israel, the Middle East, and the Jewish world, don't forget to subscribe to and follow Haaretz.com. I'm Alison Kaplan-Summer, and until next time, shalom from Tel Aviv.